As the prisoners stepped into the American camp expecting control, restriction, and hostility, they moved forward with the same guarded pace they had learned to maintain. But as the first moments passed without interruption and the environment around them did not respond the way they had anticipated, several of them began to slow their movement, not because they were stopped, but because what they saw did not match what they had been prepared for. Nothing forced them to change, but something began to. The prisoners moved through the entrance in a steady line, stepping forward one after another as they entered the camp, their movement controlled and consistent as they followed the path ahead without hesitation at first. One man near the front adjusted his pace slightly as he crossed into the open yard, turning his head briefly toward the side before facing forward again while continuing to walk. Another prisoner stepped forward behind him, maintaining the same distance, then slowed slightly as the space ahead remained open without interruption. A third man shifted his position within the line, stepping a few inches to the side to gain a clearer view of the yard, then returned to his original direction while continuing forward. One prisoner looked toward a group of structures as he walked, following them with his eyes, then faced forward again as he reduced his pace slightly. Another man near the center took 2 steady steps, then shortened his next step as he adjusted to the changing rhythm of the group. A third prisoner lifted his head and looked toward a guard in the distance, holding his gaze for a moment before continuing without being addressed. One man moved closer to the edge of the path, stepping outward slightly, then corrected his direction and returned to alignment with the others. Another prisoner adjusted his posture while walking, straightening his back slightly, then slowing his pace as the movement ahead became less defined. A third man stepped forward and then slightly to the side, repositioning himself within the group before continuing in a straight line. One prisoner near the front took another step forward, then reduced his speed as he entered the center of the yard, holding his position for a moment before moving again. Another man turned his head toward the buildings again, scanning them more carefully this time before facing forward. A third prisoner stepped forward with a longer stride, then shortened his next step as the group began to lose its earlier rhythm. One man slowed more noticeably, allowing the distance between himself and the others to change, then stopped completely for a brief moment before stepping forward again. Another prisoner moved slightly closer to another man, reducing the space between them as both of them adjusted their position without speaking. The movement that had begun as a controlled line gradually changed into a slower and less structured pattern as each prisoner responded differently to the space around him. And as more of them began to adjust their pace without being directed, the first shift took place, because what they were experiencing did not require immediate resistance, but it also did not match what they had expected. As the line began to loosen and the movement across the yard became less structured, several prisoners started to shift their attention away from the path ahead and toward the details around them, adjusting their pace as they observed what was happening without being instructed. One man near the front turned his head toward a group of prisoners already inside the yard, watching them for a moment as they moved without urgency, then slowed his own pace before continuing forward. Another prisoner stepped slightly out of line, moving a few inches to the side as he walked, then stopped briefly as he noticed no one corrected his position. A third man advanced forward more slowly, shortening his stride as he looked toward the buildings, then held his position for a moment before taking another step. One prisoner near the center shifted his direction slightly, angling his movement toward the open space instead of following the original path, then slowed when nothing redirected him. Another man turned his head toward a guard again, holding his gaze longer this time while continuing to walk, then reduced his pace when the guard did not respond. A third prisoner stepped forward and then paused, placing both feet firmly on the ground as he looked around before moving again. One man adjusted his position within the group, stepping closer to another prisoner, then slowing as both of them observed the same area ahead. Another prisoner moved closer to the edge of the yard, increasing the distance between himself and the others, then stopped when no boundary was enforced. A third man took a longer step forward, then immediately shortened his next step as he adjusted to the lack of direction. One prisoner turned his head toward the fence line, following it with his eyes while continuing to walk, then slowed when no activity appeared along it. Another man shifted his posture, straightening slightly, then stopped as he reached a point where no one guided him further. A third prisoner moved forward again, then paused mid-step, holding his position as he waited for something to happen. One man stepped slightly backward, increasing the space between himself and the others, then remained still as he looked around. Another prisoner walked past the position where others had slowed down earlier, then stopped in a new spot as the space ahead remained open. A third man adjusted his stance again, turning his body slightly while standing, then holding that position without continuing. The yard now held a mix of movement and stillness, with each prisoner reacting differently to what he was seeing, no longer guided by a single rhythm. And as more of them slowed down, stepped aside, or stopped entirely without being corrected, the second shift took place, because what they were experiencing was no longer being tested, it was beginning to be accepted. As the movement across the yard continued without interruption, several prisoners began to move with less caution, not because they were certain of what would happen next, but because nothing around them had forced them to stop or correct their direction. One man near the center stepped forward in a straight line, placing his foot with more confidence than before, then continued for a second step without slowing. Another prisoner shifted his path slightly and walked diagonally across the yard, moving away from the others instead of following any visible direction, then stopped after a few steps. A third man advanced toward the buildings, taking steady steps as he approached closer, then paused as he reached a point where he expected to be stopped. One prisoner near the front moved past the position where others had stopped earlier, continuing forward for several steps before slowing down again. Another man stepped closer to the fence line, reducing the distance between himself and the boundary, then stopped just before reaching it. A third prisoner crossed through an open space between two small groups, walking directly through the gap before stopping on the other side. One man turned his head repeatedly while walking, scanning different directions, then slowed as he reached a position where no one else was standing. Another prisoner moved forward with a slightly faster pace, taking 3 continuous steps, then reduced his speed as he entered a more open area. A third man adjusted his direction mid-step, angling his movement back toward the center, then stopped once he reached a new position. One prisoner near the back stepped forward to close a gap between himself and the others, then stopped once he reached alignment. Another man moved outward again, increasing the distance between himself and the group, then remained still as he looked around. A third prisoner approached closer to a guard than before, reducing the distance step by step, then stopped as the guard remained unmoving. One man walked parallel to the guard for several steps, maintaining a close distance, then slowed and stopped without being addressed. Another prisoner stepped forward again, then paused halfway through his movement, holding his position as if waiting for a reaction that never came. A third man advanced further than most of the others, taking several uninterrupted steps before stopping in a distant position. The yard no longer held hesitation as its dominant pattern, but instead a series of independent movements that continued until each one reached its own limit. And as more prisoners began to move without waiting for others to act first, the third shift took place, because what had started as uncertainty was now turning into a form of controlled exploration. As the independent movement across the yard continued to expand, several prisoners began to direct their actions toward the people and structures they had expected to control them, moving closer with deliberate steps while watching carefully for any sign of response. One man near the center turned his body toward a guard standing at the edge of the yard and walked directly toward him, reducing the distance step by step before stopping a short distance away. Another prisoner shifted his path and began walking parallel to the same guard, maintaining a close distance for several steps before slowing down and stopping while keeping his eyes fixed on him. A third man approached the boundary of the yard again, taking a longer step than before and pausing as he reached a point where he expected to be stopped. One prisoner near the front turned fully toward a different guard and took several steady steps in his direction, then slowed and stopped when no reaction followed. Another man walked past a guard at a closer distance than earlier, continuing forward without hesitation, then stopped once he had passed without being addressed. A third prisoner moved between two guards positioned apart from each other, crossing the space between them before slowing down and stopping after clearing the area. One man near the fence line turned his head toward a watchtower, looking upward briefly before lowering his gaze again as no movement appeared. Another prisoner stepped forward again, then paused mid-step, holding his position as if waiting for a command that never came. A third man adjusted his stance near a guard, stepping slightly closer than before, then stopping without any visible response from him. One prisoner moved across the yard in a straight line, passing through an area where several others had already stopped, then halted at a new position without being redirected. Another man stepped sideways again, increasing the distance between himself and the others, then remained still while observing the space around him. A third prisoner walked toward the buildings, reaching a closer distance than before, then stopped as the entrances remained quiet and unchanged. One man turned his head slowly from one side to the other while standing, scanning the entire yard before returning his gaze forward and remaining still. Another prisoner stepped forward once more, then stopped immediately after completing the step, holding his position without continuing further. The guards remained still throughout, without speaking, without moving, and without restoring any form of structure to the movement unfolding in front of them. And as the prisoners continued to move closer, pass by, and test the space around those who were expected to control them without receiving any response, the fourth shift took place because the expectation of control had fully collapsed and nothing replaced it. As the expectation of control faded completely, the prisoners began to change the way they used the space, not by moving randomly, but by extending their actions further and holding their positions longer without looking for confirmation. One man near the edge stepped closer to the fence than before, placing his foot near the boundary and remaining there instead of pulling back. Another prisoner shifted his direction and walked across the yard at a wider angle, covering more distance before slowing down and stopping in an open area. A third man moved toward one of the buildings, reaching the edge and pausing there, then remaining in place without turning back. One prisoner near the center increased his pace briefly, closing the distance between himself and a small group, then stopped and held his position among them. Another man stepped past a point where several others had previously stopped, continuing forward and then standing still as nothing interrupted him. A third prisoner crossed from one side of the yard to the other, moving through the open space between groups before stopping in a new position. One man approached a guard more directly than anyone had before, reducing the distance step by step until he stood close enough to observe him clearly, then remained there. Another prisoner turned away from the boundary and walked back toward the center, retracing part of his path, then slowing and stopping among the others. A third man walked further than most, taking several uninterrupted steps before stopping in a distant position and remaining there without moving. One prisoner stepped forward again after stopping, continuing for a short distance before halting once more, maintaining the same extended pattern of movement. Another man adjusted his direction mid-step, changing his path slightly, then stopping after reaching a new position. A third prisoner moved closer to another group, reducing the distance between them, then stood still as the spacing became tighter. One man near the back advanced steadily, closing a gap that had remained open, then stopped once the space was filled. Another prisoner stepped outward again, increasing the distance between himself and the others, then remained still while looking around. The yard now held longer movements, wider distances, and more stable positions, with each prisoner remaining where he chose instead of returning to a shared pattern. And as the prisoners continued to hold their positions without looking for correction or instruction, the fifth shift took place, because what had started as hesitation and turned into testing had now become acceptance of a space that no longer imposed limits. As the extended movement across the yard continued for a short time, the pace began to settle naturally, not because anything forced it to stop, but because each prisoner had already reached a position where no further action was required. One man, near the far edge, turned back toward the center, taking 2 steady steps before slowing down and stopping among a small group that had formed. Another prisoner who had been standing still for several seconds resumed movement, stepping forward in a straight line, then reducing his pace and holding his position once he reached a new point. A third man shifted his direction again, walking from the center toward a different side of the yard, then stopping without looking toward the guards. One prisoner near the boundary stepped away from the fence, increasing the distance between himself and the edge, then aligning himself with others nearby. Another man crossed the yard from one side to the other, moving between scattered groups before stopping at a position where he remained still. A third prisoner advanced forward steadily, closing a gap between himself and another group, then stopping once the distance was reduced. One man who had been moving unpredictably earlier now walked in a straight line, then stopped and held his position without repeating the movement. Another prisoner adjusted his stance slightly, stepping closer to others and reducing the space between them before becoming still. A third man stepped away from a group, then returned again, repositioning himself before stopping completely. One prisoner near the back moved forward in a controlled manner, closing the distance between himself and the center, then stopping once he reached it. Another man turned his body slightly while walking, then straightened and held his new position without further movement. The scattered motion began to organize itself into a slower and more stable arrangement, not directed by any command, but formed through repeated adjustments made by each individual. One prisoner looked briefly toward the entrance they had come from, then returned his gaze forward and remained still. Another man shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, then stopped moving entirely as the space around him settled. The yard no longer showed continuous movement, but a stable distribution of positions where each prisoner stood without continuing further. And as the final movements faded and no new actions replaced them, the last shift took place, because what had begun as hesitation and turned into exploration had now settled into a state that no longer required any instruction. They had expected the camp to define their movement, to control their direction, and to enforce limits at every step. But as they entered the space and nothing responded to them, nothing corrected them, and nothing replaced the structure they had prepared for, their behavior changed in a way they had not anticipated, because the absence of control did not immediately create freedom. It created hesitation that shaped every action they took. As their movement slowed, then spread into independent paths, and finally settled into stillness again, the pattern that formed was not imposed from outside, but built entirely from the way each prisoner reacted to what did not happen, adjusting his position based on the absence of response rather than the presence of instruction. And as the moment ended without a single command being given or a single boundary being enforced, the realization remained visible through their actions alone, because what had been missing from the beginning had never returned, and that absence had already changed the way they moved, stopped, and understood the space in front of them. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.